get some more interesting details coming in. As far as this particular meeting is concerned, we have Sumita Karir who's joining in with some more details. Sumita, very important escalation in terms of the tensions. We've seen quite the commentary coming from both of the leaders. What is your take in terms of the key takeaways then?
Absolutely. In fact, unprecedented scenes were seen in the White House, in the Oval Office. And this is a first for global diplomacy as well. These kind of scenes have not really been witnessed over many decades. And of course, this was one meeting that the world was watching with bated breath, because what happens in the Russia-Ukraine war impacts everyone. There has been impact on account of, the economic growth, which has slowed down, on impact of, oil prices, on impact of inflation, and of course, supply chain issues. So everybody was hoping that there would be perhaps a peace deal. The peace deal would not be arrived at, but at least negotiations would start with Ukraine, because very important to note that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, just a couple of days back, when US officials and Russian officials met in Saudi Arabia for the first set of talks between both the sides to arrive at a potential negotiation, at that point in time, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy had castigated, he had criticized that meeting, stating that there cannot be any talks without Ukraine on the peace table, because it is an important stakeholder as far as the resumption of peace between both the sides is concerned. There was, of course, castigation from European leaders as well. And of course, today as well, we're seeing support pour out in favor of Zelenskyy by European leaders. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has also stated, despite tempers flaring up in the Oval Office, he said that had a very fruitful meeting. Much of what was learned could never be understood without conversation under such fire and pressure. How would this really be read? How should this really be read? We will be joined by a guest very shortly, but let me also take you through what Zelenskyy has stated. Zelenskyy has stated that his relations with the United States can still be repaired. He said that in an interview to Fox News, reportedly, he said that Ukraine badly needs Washington's help in the fight against Russia, far bigger and better military. It will be difficult without your support. So let's try and put all of these developments into perspective. We're now joined by Alastair Newton, CEO, Alavant Business Advisory Limited. As always, thank you very much, Mr. Newton, for joining us here on ET Now.
Good morning, and thank you.
Right. Mr. Alastair Newton, what really happens now? What do you anticipate will be the next set of steps? Because Donald Trump has stated that, this was something that we had a very fruitful meeting in the White House. Much was learned that could have never been understood without conversation under such fire and pressure. Do you think that there will be a resumption of peace talks anytime soon between Ukraine and the United States?
I think there's bound to be a resumption of dialogue at some stage, but on what basis remains to be seen. Now, as I'm sure a lot of your viewers know, I am not a conspiracy theorist, but I'm afraid I find it difficult to dismiss suggestions in some of the press, American and international press, that Zelenskyy was effectively set up yesterday, not only by Donald Trump, but perhaps more especially by a man who is emerging as his attack dog, J.D. Vance. As Donald Trump said at the end, it all makes very good television. It will have played well with Donald Trump's supporters in America, and even more so, it will have played very well with the man with whom Donald Trump is clearly trying to build a strong relationship, and that's Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. We saw at the beginning of this week, as you know, America voting with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea at the United Nations, and with the Europeans voting on the other side of the fence over Ukraine. So there clearly is some fundamental shift going on in American foreign policy at the moment, which I think was being played out at Zelensky's expense yesterday in the Oval Office. I don't think Zelenskyy played it very smartly. He's a man who does tend to wear his emotions on his sleeve, but I do think he was effectively mugged by the US president and vice president. Keep in mind, though, that Donald Trump swings backwards and forwards very regularly on all issues pretty much, and he is quite likely to come back with a softer tone in the not too distant future, especially after Zelenskyy held out an olive branch, and especially given Donald Trump's preoccupation with mineral rights in Ukraine, which matter enormously to America on a strategic basis, particularly with an eye to its rivalry with China.
Absolutely, Mr. Newton, because Donald Trump at one point said that he's not favoring Russia, he's not favoring Ukraine. He wants a peace deal for the betterment of the world. And of course, he's thinking for America. So this is, of course, largely centered around the minerals deal with Ukraine. And that's what is in the interest of the United States. But European leaders, Mr. Newton, if we see European leaders have all come out in support of Zelensky. They have earlier also had a meeting in Europe just before that meeting between US officials and the Russian side as well. But what has happened today? How much does that really impact Ukraine's negotiating power if peace negotiations start anytime soon?
Well, let's split that into two parts. Donald Trump has not been talking about peace negotiations. He's been talking repeatedly about a ceasefire. The number of times he said during that Oval Office TV session, we want a ceasefire, we want a ceasefire, we want a ceasefire. What Zelensky wants is peace negotiations, because Zelensky and the Europeans, and I guess a lot of people around Donald Trump as well, fully understand that based on Russia's conduct over Ukraine since 2016 or so, a ceasefire is not worth the paper it is written on. Vladimir Putin will take a ceasefire. He will use the opportunity to re-strengthen his military, which has suffered enormously during the course of the last 3 years, perhaps have sanctions relief, which will allow him to make good the damage to his economy, and then he will come back to aggression against Ukraine and possibly even against other European countries. The ceasefire would suit Vladimir Putin very well. It is not sufficient to guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty and security. Zelensky and the Europeans fully understand that. Donald Trump just wants a ceasefire. He's not talking peace negotiations. So I don't think we are going to be looking at proper, formal, structured peace negotiations in the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. And Mr. Newton, then how does that impact the global markets, which have been shuddering under Trump's tariff pressure? Now, do you foresee a situation wherein this gets further exacerbated, especially on the markets front?
Well, I don't, it's hard to see a direct correlation between events in Ukraine or around Ukraine and global markets. There's lots going on which is impacting on global markets. A lot of Donald Trump's domestic policies, what's going on in the oil market is very significant. We're seeing the bond market starting to worry about tariffs. Let's keep in mind that also in the middle of last week, Donald Trump reiterated and increased his threat of tariffs against the European Union. 25% tariffs against the European Union would not be negligible as far as markets are concerned. It would be a major shock to markets, far bigger than arguments in the White House over the future of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. He also reiterated his threat of escalated tariffs against Mexico and Canada, which again would have a major impact on global markets. So I think we need to look very widely for the Trump impact on markets and not just focus on Ukraine, which is by no means unimportant, but in many respects, in my view, is something of a sideshow as far as markets are concerned, other than underlining the unpredictability of Donald Trump by design. And this is designer chaos we're looking at, coupled with his blowing hot and cold on all sorts of issues, which makes it really difficult for investors to determine where Donald Trump is ultimately going to come down at the end of the day, insofar as there is an end of a day, because let's take this to India. Your Prime Minister Narendra Modi just had a very successful visit to the US. It went very well. The two men had substantive talks as well as a warm relationship. But can India actually rely on Donald Trump sticking to the sort of tone and substance of that meeting with Narendra Modi into the future as he turns his attention increasingly to Asia and as he blatantly looks to move to a multipolar world with three spheres of influence, i.e. America, China, and Russia, which clearly does have a direct impact on India as one of China's neighbors.
Right. So we can surely expect some volatility in the future so far as Trump's policies are concerned. But you're stating that this particular incident might or might not have a direct impact, at least in the near term. One final question to you, Mr. Newton, before we let you go. What does this incident really reveal about United States' approach to foreign policy and diplomacy, and of course, with respect to all the alliances that it has?
Well, first of all, I think for the moment, we can park Asia largely because Donald Trump has not really turned his attention to Asia, other than he had quite a warm meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister. And as I mentioned a moment ago, he had a very warm meeting with Narendra Modi. But for the moment, Donald Trump's attention seems to be largely on Western Hemisphere, Panama, Mexico, Canada. He had that spat with Colombia right at the beginning of his current term of office, and in particular on Europe. Now, we shouldn't underestimate this for one moment for two reasons. First of all, Europe and the US are major trading partners. Tariffs there, as I said earlier, would be a big shock to markets. The Europeans will retaliate, and it is going to get into areas which are not trading goods. It's obvious, and it has been obvious for a long time, that a lot of Trump's animus towards Europe revolves around the interests of his big tech bros and things like the European Digital Services Act and digital services taxes. And we are likely to see an escalation there. As far as strategy is concerned, the Europeans have finally woken up to the fact that the writing is very clearly on the wall. There was the vote in the UN. There was this incident last night. The Europeans are going to have to step up on their own security significantly. Basically, the transatlantic alliance, as we have understood it since 1949, Harry Truman, the Atlantic alliance looks broken, looks fundamentally broken. And if you listen to, for example, the Chancellor designate to all intents and purposes, Friedrich Merz, in Germany this week after the German election, even in Germany, you have a Chancellor designate who is stepping up and saying, Europe has to be strategically independent on security. That is going to be a fundamental shift in geopolitics. It is going to change the fabric of the world, and it is already underway. And inevitably, it will spill over into Asia in due course. The one exception to this at the moment seems to be the UK. Keir Starmer had a very good meeting with Donald Trump on Thursday, but not every European leader has Starmer's trump card, which is the king. Very appealing to Donald Trump, the King of England. Unfortunately, not all countries have that. But the meeting in London tomorrow, chaired by Starmer, will be critical in the evolution of this.
That will be critical. And Mr. Newton, there are lots of moving pieces to this story. We'll have to see what really happens next and what it really means for Ukraine next. Lots of analysts whom we have spoken to have also stated that this performance by the president, the US president, vice president in the Oval Office, it was unprecedented, but it was not altogether surprising as well, given Donald Trump's well-known feelings about US military support to Ukraine, and of course the narrative that he's been on about with him actually siding more with Russia than with Ukraine. On that note, thank you very much, Mr. Newton, for joining us and sharing your thoughts on this developing story.
Thank you.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.